Over here, stranger. Got something that might interest you.
Forget everything you think you know about Resident Evil.
I'm under the President's order to rescue you.
My father? Oh my god! What's going on?
Don't worry, Ashley. I'm coming for you.
Vayan por detrás.
Evil has evolved. Resident Evil 4 for Nintendo GameCube. Rated M for mature. Only from Capcom.
How's it going, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the All-Time Gaming Series. I'm Steve Cravens.
And I'm Andres Gallego AKA Galleghost.
And welcome to our retrospective for Capcom's 2005 masterpiece, Resident Evil 4, which was actually released on January 11th of 2005, which makes this game 16 years old, which is, it makes me gag just a little bit. Because when this game came out, I was 15 years old, which means more time has passed since this game's come out than I was when this game came. I mean, that's, oh my God, man. Well, I said this on our Friday the 13th episode. We're getting old. No, we're getting better. We're getting better. That's what we're not getting older. We're getting better.
Just like this game does, doesn't it?
Just like, exactly like this game. We are the Resident Evil 4 of humanity. We keep getting better the older we get. So, Andres, you are the Resident Evil expert here among the two of us. I mean, I consider myself a big fan, but you, sir, are a super fan. So why don't you go ahead and break down the history of Resident Evil for us, as well as a little bit of the background of Resident Evil 4, the plot recap, and then we'll start getting into some more, finer aspects of the game.
Absolutely, dude. It all started back in '96 with Shinji Mikami when he produced the first Resident Evil game on the Saturn, on the PlayStation. And for the time, it wasn't necessarily the biggest gore fest in terms of a run and gun type of violent type of game. It was actually more of a puzzle game more than anything else. And that's why I think drew a lot of players to it. I mean, Simon Pegg pretty much put it best in Spaced, where he was like, it's a subtle combination of lateral thinking and extreme violence. And I'm like, yep, that sums it up right there. And also by that point in the 90s, we were starved for anything zombie related whatsoever. I mean, it was at least 10 years since George Romero's Day of the Dead had come out, and we just didn't have anything that was giving us a zombie fix. So the game was massively successful, and then they got a sequel about 2 or 3 years later that actually ended up going halfway into production, and they just restarted it right off the bat because they were like, this is not working, we need to make this better. And then they came out with another third game 1 year later, and then Code Veronica on the Saturn, and then later on this game actually came out on the GameCube. But what the big difference between this game and all the other ones was that this game actually took a much more action-oriented approach to it, as opposed to how the other games were more of a puzzle game. And some people think that it worked well for it, and then some people had their disagreements about it. Personally, I loved that change, and I loved how it went. But overall, that's kind of the brief history with the game so far. Well, the general gist of 4, it takes place 6 years after the Raccoon City incident, which is basically the outbreak in Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3. And you follow the protagonist of 2 6 years later, Leon S. Kennedy, but instead of being a cop, he is actually now a government agent working under the direction of the President of the United States. And you are sent over to Spain to investigate the disappearance of the President's daughter. And when you get over to this small little village, you start finding out that certain things aren't necessarily what they seem. And instead of finding the flesh-eating zombies from Resident Evil, you actually find something completely different, and you actually find more possessed human beings, to put it lightly, spoilers. But you start discovering a plot that runs bigger than itself, and that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the start of Resident Evil 4.
It's a great summarization of the plot. So why don't we go ahead and start diving into some serious spoilers. I have a feeling if people are watching this, they're already familiar with the game, but forgive us, we like to cover all the bases when we talk about games like this. So what did you want to talk about first when it comes to Resident Evil 4?
Well, first thing I wanted to talk about was, what was our history with the franchise in general? I mean, we all know, as you summed it up best, I'm a huge Resident Evil fan, but I'm kind of curious as to what your into the series was, and also talk about the first time that you played the game as well too.
Okay, so for my history with the series, I actually was introduced to Resident Evil by a cousin of mine on the PlayStation. That was my first introduction. So I want to say that was 1999, maybe 99, 98, around there. That was my introduction to Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2. Now, at that age, I mean, watching those games, it was kind of an unbelievable experience. It was I'd never seen video games like that before. Now, I had seen Metal Gear Solid, but the violence within Metal Gear Solid and the tension within Metal Gear Solid was a much more action-driven experience, which is what Resident Evil 4 eventually segued into. But Resident Evil 1 and 2 were much more horror-based. I mean, that's survival horror. That's what they pioneered. So it was a totally different experience. And I remember the anxiety I felt watching him play those games because he was older than I am. So that was my introduction to that at a very young age. And it kind of, in a weird way, as terrified as I was of the game, it also put the hook in my brain for the genre as a whole. I wanted more. I wanted to, when Resident Evil 3 came out, I wanted to play it. Eventually I did get to play it at a friend's house, a couple years later. But those two were the introduction to the franchise for me. Now, Resident Evil 4, I was very intrigued by because one, I was like, okay, it's coming out to the GameCube, so the graphics are going to be absolutely incredible. Because back then, I mean, the GameCube graphics were just like, I mean, you could still look at a game like Metroid Prime and be like, this came out on the GameCube?
Yeah.
I mean, now we have the remaster for Resident Evil 4, with the PlayStation 4 and things of that nature. But even if you go back and look at the GameCube version of Resident Evil 4, it still looks and sounds terrific. But I remember reading the news about it and Shinji Mikami kind of saying, we're going to take this into a new direction. We're going to take this into a more action-oriented, kind of style, if you will. And I remember playing it the weekend it came out and just being completely blown away. Every expectation I had was just, I mean, it exceeded it and then some, quite frankly, because Resident Evil, the one thing I love about Resident Evil games is that you already have an idea of what these games should be in your mind, what you expect them to be, in terms of the environments, in terms of the villains you're going to be going up against. And Resident Evil 4 said, okay, we're going to meet those expectations of what you have, what you think this game should be when we've given you these descriptions of what we're going for. And then it gives you stuff that you didn't even consider that you would want to play or experience. So yes, 2005, that weekend back in January was wild, man. That was and I knew right away while I was playing it, before I beat it, this is one of the greatest games of all time. This will go down as one of the greatest video games of all time. I knew it right then. How about you? Well, tell us a little bit. I mean, you're the maestro, man. You know everything about these games. Why don't you go ahead and tell us, what was your first experience like playing any Resident Evil? I guess not any Resident Evil, but what were your first emotions playing it? And then also, like you said, Resident Evil 4.
Well, for me, this was sort of like the forbidden fruit when I was a kid, because again, my cousins as well too all owned the game, and I remember walking into the houses and always seeing a copy of either Resident Evil 2, that cover art, and seeing Chris Redfield on the cover, and he's got the gun cocked up, and I'm like, holy crap, that actually looks kind of cool. And then later on in life, all of a sudden, that infamous cover for Resident Evil 2 that looked even creepy, just walking down Blockbuster, it was like, holy crap, this game must be amazing. And I remember it was sort of like the gauntlet was always thrown every time when my cousins would see me want to play that game, and they're like, nah, it's way too scary for you, way too scary for you. My parents at the time were also very adamant about what content I was exposed to at the time. So it was kind of forbidden for me to play Resident Evil at first. And what ended up happening was I ended up getting Dino Crisis, and Dino Crisis actually came with a demo for Resident Evil 3. So technically, playing Resident Evil 3 was my first experience into the franchise. But I knew as soon as I played through that demo for Resident Evil 3, I was hooked. I was automatically hooked. And then finally, I think I got my uncle to crack and get me Resident Evil 3 for a graduating middle school present.
Graduating back when we took advantage of that.
Yeah, exactly. So pretty much my high school experience was just playing nothing but Resident Evil games, and I was immediately hooked into the franchise. Having said that, by the time 4 was announced, I had kind of fallen off of the franchise a little bit because at that point in time, we had just gotten stuff like Code Veronica, which was a great game in particular, but it did have a game-breaking glitch where if you didn't do something at a certain point in time, the game was literally unbeatable.
Yeah.
And the other thing, too, is that we were getting Outbreak. We were getting a couple other things that weren't necessarily... Yeah, the franchise was starting to dwindle, and I think it really came to a head when I played Gun Survivor, and I was like, okay, I think I'm done with the franchise.
Yeah, it's funny. So I played Resident Evil Outbreak in 2004, which was a year before Resident Evil 4 came out, and I remember even then, despite it being fun, and I was on a Resident Evil kind of high at the time because Snyder's Dawn of the Dead remake had come out March 2004, shortly after, and then 28 days later, the year before that. Yes. So I was already kind of like on this like zombie hype, but even so, I remember playing Resident Evil Outbreak and kind of being like, man, we're starting to run out of gas a little bit here. Like this, it's really starting to get a little bit repetitive. You know what I mean? Like, how many times can we be in Raccoon City? How many times? I know zombies were a staple of that was the series. It was zombies, it was other monsters, mutated monsters, spiders, things, snakes. But it was getting a little stale. It was getting a little long in the tooth. So yeah, I agree with you. Like it was kind of like getting into Resident Evil 4, reading the news coming out about it. That's what kind of rekindled the interest in playing it and hearing how different it was going to be. That's what stoked my interest more than anything. Because like you, I was like, we're starting to get a little stale here. We're starting to get a little repetitive.
Well, the other thing, too, was that when they announced Resident Evil 4, it was supposed to be a radically different game than what came out eventually. In fact, it was more of a ghost story type of game, which I remember seeing the gameplay footage for that. And I'm like, this could be scary, but it's just replacing zombies with ghosts. And I don't think that's not Resident Evil to me. So I was kind of just on my last legs with the series, really. And I almost kind of given up on it. And then January 11th finally came through, and again, I never pre-ordered it, but I kept hearing all the word of mouth for it, and just so many people just overblown excitement for the game. Even my best friend Jakeem at the time, who does not like anything horror related whatsoever, had picked up a copy of the game, and he was just going, holy crap, you need to play this. This is automatically your game, dude. It's astounding that you're a Resident Evil fan and you didn't even play this. So went ahead, got it, and immediately, same thing as you said, it was such a groundbreaking experience for me, and it was far different than anything I had played, even not only in terms of gaming, but in terms of the series. So it was a masterpiece right off the bat.
It's one of those instant classics, those rare instant classics where as soon as you play it, you know right away that you're dealing with a work of art that was really, it's a labor of love for the creators of this game. It's not just a simple cash grab. And I'm not saying that, Resident Evil 2 or 3 or Outbreak or Code Veronica or cash grabs. That's not what I'm saying, even though some people might make that argument. I'm simply saying that there was a level of craftsmanship in this game that obviously was afforded due to the GameCube's, upgrading graphics, obviously. That's, we're not going to compare PlayStation to GameCube, or Nintendo 64 to GameCube for that matter. It's not fair.
But it was a big leap.
But it was a huge leap. And Mikami and his team at Capcom really took advantage of it and delivered something that was it was different. It was a breath of fresh air, and yet it was still very much a Resident Evil game. You know what I mean? Like you saying like, oh, it was about to be a ghost story. Well, shit. There's being different, and then there's being different to the point of we don't recognize this franchise anymore. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like what like if you're going to do a ghost story, then why don't you do a separate series or just a standalone game with that? That's not what this series is. So they were walking a fine line, man, of like, how do we create something different, but still give them what they want and what they expect? And they achieved it.
Absolutely.
They really did. They achieved it. Resident Evil 4 is an amazing accomplishment on so many levels.
Well, the next thing I wanted to talk about actually was the gameplay. In terms of the difference between the gameplay of the first couple of games between this one, it was a drastic difference. Not only in terms of the gameplay, but also in terms of the presentation as well, too. Sure. right off the bat, the look for this game, this was probably the first game that I ever experienced where it presented itself in a letterbox format. And that just contributed to the cinematic feel all the way through. But with Resident Evil 4 in particular, it blended so smoothly between gameplay and cinematics. And so much so to the point that this was probably the first game that you could never put down your controller, because odds are one of the cutscenes had a thing where you just had to press a certain button at a certain time, otherwise you would die. Yeah. So this game had a particular sense of using the gameplay elements to fuel the cinematic elements and have them blend so seamlessly into a brand new experience that also upped the tension and it also upped the production level. So for me, right off the bat, that was what was different with the gameplay for me.
For me, the whole presentation was just so new to me because, you mentioned Dino Crisis. The Resident Evil games and Dino Crisis, they all had that still camera perspective. You know what I mean? Like,
yes.
Oh, we're going to put the camera here, and then we're going to have you, operate the character either on the D-pad or, eventually later on the analog stick, especially if you played N64. But, all of a sudden we have this over-the-shoulder perspective, over the right shoulder. And the camera was kind of like, free wandering, like you didn't have this like awkward, like, oh shit, if I walk into this room, it's going to, be over here. And then I have to like awkwardly back out and turn away. There was a range of motion that even though the game is very linear, it's not open world, you still had this freedom of mobility that was so new and so exciting to it, and you mentioned the letterbox screen, especially back then before, most of us had flat screens. It did lend itself to being more cinematic in that way, because most of the DVDs we were watching at that time were widescreen too. So we were kind of getting accustomed to that, like having VHS be full screen, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, wait, we're supposed to be watching our movies in the letterbox. Yeah, so it just made the presentation was much more cinematic, like you said, and it brought a level of, in addition to the graphics, a production value to it. Where it wasn't just another video game. And I agree with you 100% in terms of the controls, because yes, you had to be on your toes, because at any given time, this wasn't like we'll wait for the cutscene and we'll know when a cutscene happens because, the aspect ratios will change. Anytime there could be a jump scare that comes out or an enemy that comes out that tries to slash at you and you have to press, a certain button in rapid succession to dodge it. I'm actually thinking about the very first one I can remember is when that huge boulder comes tumbling at you and you have to, tap really quick, tap it, and then hit the two real quick and then dodge out of the way. I mean, that was just so exciting and so new, and that let you know it's like you can never take a break playing this game. You can never just kind of relax and just take it easy. You are always on edge playing the game.
And to also add on top of that, if you died during that sequence and you go, you know what? Just keep tapping this button. I know I'm going to have to tap R2 and L2 at the same time. The button mashes are deviously randomized. So yes. You even could not even get used to, oh, hey, what buttons do I have to press? You only knew that something was coming, but you never knew what was coming before.
Yeah, no, Mikami is a little bastard, man. I mean, like you think you're gonna have to press X and Y here? No, sir. No, I got you programmed to think that way. No, you're gonna have to tap, Z real quick, or A real quick, or B real. So yeah, that led to the unpredictability of it, and increased the anxiety of it all. So yeah, the gameplay, and at the end of the day, I mean, we're gonna talk about a bunch of different aspects of this game. But the gameplay itself, the engine that they used, the engine that they developed and used for the game, I mean, to say that it is a massive legacy of Capcom in terms of their contributions to modern gaming, not just in the horror genre, but in many genres. Yeah. The game is a masterpiece, yes, but it's also groundbreaking. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, I'm sure if this game hadn't come out and they hadn't used the mechanics that they did, eventually we would have gotten a game that would have done it. But that's not the point. The point is that this game did it. And it changed the way we play video games forever and for always, really, if you think about it.
That just goes to show you the legacy that this game had going forward, not only for the franchise, but for games in general. Before Resident Evil 4, no other game had done the over-the-shoulder perspective or the over-the-shoulder aiming with the camera.
It's true.
after Resident Evil 4, you saw game after game take something from Resident Evil 4, whether it be the camera perspective, whether it be the button mashing, whether it be the cinematic presentation in terms of, oh, you have to press a button during the cutscenes. A lot of games like Gears of War, Uncharted, they all owe a debt of gratitude to this game, because it broke so many things, and it also tried so many things that people just kept saying, no, you can't do that in a game, or it just wasn't achieved at the time. This game is just so incredibly well put together in so many aspects, in terms of trying something new for not only the franchise, but also trying something brand new for gaming in general.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. Couldn't agree with you more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And, well, let's get right into it as well, too. In terms of Resident Evil 4, what are some of your favorite characters?
I mean, I think the obvious one is Leon. I mean, I love, I remember reading that, a couple of developers over at Capcom wanted to make Leon a lot cooler. They want, they wanted, especially with the, the jacket that he has on, the voice he has on is very cool, and he's, wisecracking, and I loved playing as Leon throughout the whole game. There are some Resident Evil games that I've played that I will not name, that I wasn't completely sold on the protagonist that I was playing as, either because of the voice acting or because of the writing, decisions that the character made, that, I wasn't too on board with. But I loved Leon because, as much as he kind of is, he's kind of like the John McClane of the situation, where he's human enough that he's relatable. He's not quite Superman, where he doesn't really get affected by the stuff around him. But you do feel like when he gets into these situations, you as the gamer, you can feel the threat, and you can feel Leon's threat to it, and his confusion to the situation, and trying to figure out what is going on in this village, and then eventually in the castles, and uncovering the conspiracy that's going on and the real plot of what's happening. I love Leon. He's my favorite Resident Evil character ever.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on Leon. I mean, in terms of a character that has grown from the second game going into this one, you felt like he was more experienced, you felt like he was more tougher, and you felt like the environment that 4 was taking place in automatically, lent itself to that. So, no, I absolutely agree. Yeah. But, I mean, there's so many great characters in this game. When you boil it down to, Ashley is memorable in her own way, Lewis is memorable in his own way, but probably one of the other ones that made a big impression on me, and he's a very minimal character, is the Merchant.
He might be the one person that everybody thinks of when they play this game.
Got something you might be interested in. Again, talking about just the out of place nature with this. It's an Australian guy in Spain. It's like, it's just so perfect.
And also, it's like, with all the stuff Leon's been through, it's like, man, you're just going to trust this, sketchy dude in like these garments that's just happens to have everything you need and talks like a total creep. You know what I mean? Like, not enough cash, stranger. Who? You're going to do business with that guy? All right. I get desperate times call for desperate measures.
Yeah, no, and he provided his own laughs in the game as well, too. And he provided his own just little flair in terms of the uncomfortability of the game as well, where you're just like, all right, I guess I have no choice but to trust him. And if you look directly at him, he's got Las Plagas. If you look at his eyes, he's got the Plagas in him, so he's not on the level. But it was just so brilliant to incorporate him. And just for a character that is as sketchy as he is, whenever you came across him, in terms of the save rooms as well, too, it sort of provided a serenity, if you will, to the entire game. It provided you a moment to breathe.
It did. Getting to a save point, getting to a typewriter was like, I imagine that's how marathon runners feel like when they finally reach the end of, like, it just like, oh, thank God, finally this is over. And I've always said this, the music in the background when you're about to save, I could listen to that and fall asleep. And that just adds to the relaxing nature of that. It's like, oh man, you know what? I'm going to save, and then I'm just going to let this just be on my TV for a couple of minutes and just kind of like, zone out for a little bit. And then I'll just get back into the chaos and madness that this game happens. But you're absolutely right. as creepy as this guy is, he is a huge. You breathe a sigh of relief when he seems like, oh, thank God, it's the creep. You know, like I can't wait to buy something from him or sell him something. You know, and hear his creepy voice talking to me about how I don't have enough cash, or I'll buy it at a high price. Like, I mean, God.
And just the commentary that it has for certain guns that you buy, where he's like, stranger, now that's a weapon. Or like one of my favorite ones where you buy the huge ass Magnum, he's like, whoa, what are you hunting with that? Elephants? You're just like, whoa, all right, he knows this is gonna be, you know, he knows shit is gonna go down with this. But yeah, no, in terms of having the merchant in as a character, he provides so much levity to the game, and, you know, again, serenity as well too. But, you know, for a character as sketchy as he was, we weren't happier to see him, and we weren't happier to at least have the interaction with him. But, you know, speaking about sketchy characters and such, let's go into talking about some of the villains.
Alrighty, let's do it. Well, Salazar for me is my favorite villain, just because you hate him from the moment you see him and from the moment you hear him. And then especially to see the grotesque abomination that he takes, you know, shape as when you start fighting him. I think he's one of the more memorable villains in the series. And you know, we keep talking about why this game's a masterpiece in the series. It's because so many things in the game are done so well that the games before it and the games after it struggled to kind of compete with it and come up with things that were as memorable as the characters within Resident Evil 4. And that obviously includes the villains. And I think Salazar is incredibly memorable in that way. You know, he's not, you know, yes, he is a monster, but to see him as in child form, you know, that was kind of unusual. It's like, wow, what the hell, this little like spoiled, you know, prick here, you know, like this is the guy where, you know, we could kick this guy's ass in like fucking like 2 seconds. Why are we even like worried about this little shit? And then it's like, oh, wait. So yeah, Salazar would be my pick for my favorite villain. It's not my favorite boss fight, but my favorite villain within the game. How about you?
Well, going along with that, probably one of my favorite characters in this entire game actually is Torres Mendez.
Wow.
Because Torres Mendez, he has sort of echoes of not only what the characters are in this universe in terms of, you know, the very Hispanic element in the game as well, but also in terms of capturing certain elements that we love about other bosses in the previous Resident Evils, where it's sort of like Torres was sort of a combination between the Tyrant and the Nemesis and the Ganados. Yes. So for me personally, Torres Mendez was one of my favorite villains that popped up in the series going forward. And he certainly did make a big impact on this game in particular.
Well, you know, real quick about the chainsaw Ganado that you mentioned, as we can see in your poster back there. I actually love that because, you know, being a huge Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan, I mean, we can call him a Chainsaw Ganado as much as much as we want. That's Leatherface. You're playing against Leatherface in a Resident Evil game. Okay, I don't care what Mikami says. That's what that is. So yeah, that was a great introduction to the game. It's like once you get to that village, it's kind of like, oh, so I get to face an entire village and this fucking maniac with a chain. Okay, and more of them do come too as well. But yeah, that was a great introduction to the game to let you know what kind of game you're going to be playing going forward. You know, in terms of the villains.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also quickly touch on some of the Ganados as well too. In terms of what the difference were with the Ganados between the zombies, you kind of feel like you could avoid them in the previous game. Like, it didn't necessarily feel like whenever you walked into a room, you had to kill them. You had to find ways to maneuver around them because you don't have enough bullets to take them all out. Whereas with the Ganados themselves, not only did you have to find a way to defeat them, in terms of using your ammunition, in terms of conserving them, but you also had to find a way to outsmart them as well too. And that also goes into more aspects of the gameplay where there's more than enough ways to maneuver your way around the Ganados, but also on top of that, there's a lot of ways for the Ganados to basically outflank you in every other moment. Like, sure. like probably one of my favorite moments that really stood out in this game as well too was during that early sequence when the Ganados are chasing after you and you board up the doors and you board up all the windows and stuff like that, and you're just like, oh, I'll be fine, I'll just wait here on the first floor and wait for that chainsaw dude to come right out. But what you didn't realize was someone broke a window up on the second floor, and not only are they getting through, they're also coming right down to you as the chainsaw Ganado breaks through. So it provided such a level of anxiety to even go against the Ganados, and also with the fact that they would speak to each other and coordinate with each other. It was like facing against velociraptors for the first time. You were just like, holy crap, what am I gonna do? It was so utterly brilliant and genius. And the other thing too with that was the fact that I can't imagine the anxiety that would be going through people who didn't speak Spanish. Personally, for me, it was kind of an added bonus because it was like, oh, I understand what they're saying to one another. But I can only imagine what it was like for someone else, like my best friend Jakeem at the time, who was playing the game, who didn't know like a Spanish and also didn't know that they were yelling at each other instructions and you could outmaneuver them in certain ways. But yeah, and that also added to the isolation of Leon in this environment, just being completely foreign to everything. And I thought that played incredibly well into the horror aspect. Although I understood everything that they were doing and everything that they were saying, I thought as a concept that worked.
First of all, you're absolutely right in the sense that you're facing off against a bunch of different velociraptors. That's what it felt like, because there is a lot of communication going on. And if you didn't speak Spanish or understand Spanish, then you didn't know what the directions they're giving each other and, what they're telling, each other to do in order to get you. And you're absolutely right. You could not flee. Well, no, you could flee from these people, but not for very long, because the game puts you in situations where you must fight or die, especially in that situation where you're in the house. You can't just stay there forever. You can't just, kind of camp out and just pick them off as they come in, because they're getting ladders to come in through the top, through the window on the top. They're coming in through the wall. You've got to think on your feet. And that's kind of a frustrating thing for me for the very few detractors this game has, because there are purists of the survival horror genre who believe that action should be held to a minimum in the survival horror genre, that you should not be given a plethora of weapons to, fend for yourself with, or ammunition for that matter, that the terror in itself comes from not having a plethora of weapons, from not having a lot of ammo and having to use your head and how, you can evade enemies to survive. I can see where they're coming from with that, but the thing is that Resident Evil 4, it's not like this is a shoot 'em up like Resident Evil 5 and then eventually Resident Evil 6 turned out to be, where it became too action oriented, where it really truly became an action game more than a horror game. This is a perfect balance of the two. Of, okay, we're going to give you a machine gun, we're going to give you a shotgun, grenades, et cetera, and so forth. But we're still going to put you in situations where you're going to have to think and not just shoot your way out of it. Because if you shoot your way out of it, you're going to run out of ammo and then you will die. So I love that. And I've never understood the few, and very few, because I know this game is it's not universally blood, but it's pretty much blood by almost every gamer out there. But the people out there who are just so holding on to that true definition of survival horror, I think this game hits survival horror perfectly, even though there's, more action than usual. Now, segueing into the locations, and your mention of speaking Spanish and things of that nature, that was another breath of fresh air with Resident Evil 4, because before we're used to being in a mansion, laboratories, Raccoon City, maybe an island or two, but this is like, no. You as the character, Leon, are in a land that is completely foreign to you. You're in Spain. You're not even in Madrid or Barcelona. You're in a very rural part of Spain. You're a complete outsider. So, yes, you have Luis at your side. Yes, Ada gets involved. Eventually you have Ashley. But for the most part, you are alone. And you're kind of like Bill Murray in Lost in Translation. You're just, you're very much, you're a gaijin, you're a gaijin in Spain. And that added another weight to you. I mean, obviously you're playing as him, but to kind of relate to Leon in that way. In Resident Evil 2, you're kind of playing on home soil. You see the signs everywhere, you can read everything, you understand everything. But in this one, it's like, again, unless you speak Spanish, you don't know what the hell's going on. And obviously the locations, as they change, it becomes a castle, and the labs. It's a Resident Evil game. You're always going to be playing in laboratories.
Third act will always be in a lab.
You'll always be in a lab, but it still felt new and it still felt fresh, and not like a retreat. I'm sure you agree with that. I know you want to talk about that as well, so I'll turn it over to you. But I wanted to say that briefly because we're going to be talking about the locations, and that was just another aspect of the fresh air, for the game. And said it's like, oh my God, we are in a completely new setting here. We're not in Raccoon City anymore. This is all so new and exciting in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully agree with you that this game and the location was a breath of fresh air for the franchise. And it was also a needed breath of fresh air, because when you look at the previous games, you're coming into a location that has been deserted, that has also been run down, and there's a mess everywhere and stuff like that. This game in particular did something a little different. When you came into the village, you felt like you were strolling in the middle of these villagers' lives during their everyday occurrence. Because there is that moment in the beginning of the game where you just see the Ganado just basically going off and doing his thing. And then you come across the legions of Granados in the town square. But they're not doing anything out of the ordinary. They're just doing their regular thing. Oh, it just so happens they're burning a outsider just out of nowhere. But you see that they're tending the chickens, they're feeding the cows and all this other stuff. It feels like you're coming into a location that has already been corrupted, but they've managed to keep going, if that makes any sense. Which that to me was even more disturbing than coming into a rundown location, if you will.
Sure, and also real quick about the villagers that you fight. With the zombies in Raccoon City, there is a touch of tragedy to it, because the zombies were people. They're ordinary people in Raccoon City just going about their daily lives until, Umbrella just basically fucked them all over with this horrible, virus. You don't really think about it too much in that sense, because, they're just mindless zombies that need to be disposed of before they eat you. Eventually, when you learn about the truth that's going on, that these villagers were poisoned by this, this plague, if you will, because it's called the Las Plagas, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, that, like, you look back on it, you're like, man, I'm killing these people because they've turned psychotic because of this, this virus they have in them, but they're still people. They're psychotic, but at the end of the day, it's like it didn't have to be like this for these people. These poor people were guinea pigs, and to be disposed of like that, it added just another layer to the game too. And you learn about who you're killing, why you're killing them, and it adds a touch of tragedy to it, really, because again, they were just ordinary people going about their business in a rural part of Spain, farmers and whatnot and what have you, villagers, tiny little communities. And they've been destroyed by this thing. And that was another interesting aspect of the game. Yeah,
absolutely. And the thing is, when you go around in a Resident Evil game, you go around the location, you start picking up files and you start reading diary entries about all the stuff that has happened. There was one particular one in this game that really summed it up for me. There was a letter from a mother in the village, and immediately you're like, wait, a mother in the village? Where are the kids? And then you find out in the title credits, as the game is ending, you see exactly how this village was off the bat, and then how it grew into this terrible, desolate location, what they did to the kids later on. As soon as the plagas had with the tests, you find out that that the children are immune to Las Plagas, so you can't have that in a city like that. So I just found that just particularly disturbing, and it added an extra layer that I didn't have with the previous games. Of course, Umbrella is an evil entity, and everything is motivated by money. But for this, you don't exactly know what the motivations of Los Illuminados is, apart from just vague things here and there. But you only need to know what you need to know.
Well, I was just going to say that, again, we're so used to Raccoon City. And again, the laboratories. The mansion in the first game is iconic. That was such a brilliant idea to set a game because it had a haunted house vibe to it. You know what I mean? It wasn't just simply, a major metropolitan area that had been, just sunk into total chaos and anarchy. We've seen all that. I thought the mansion Resident Evil, the first Resident Evil, was brilliant because it was kind of like a callback to Night of the Living Dead, where they're kind of in the farmhouse.
Exactly.
Not nearly as claustrophobic or as simple as that, but it was a nice callback to that kind of mentality all the same. Going into Resident Evil 4, I mean, setting it in Spain was brilliant. And then the interiors of the castle. So the medieval aspect of the castle really lent itself well to horror, specifically for, you know, the Resident Evil that we eventually got. I mean, it's almost kind of like stepping into a time machine, really, if you think about it. You know, you kind of are a man at a time, because even though you're in rural Spain, it's not like, you know, it's not like you're, you know, walking through 2005 Spain, you know, or something like that, even though you get brought there in the van, which, by the way, I love the intro to the game when you get brought in by the two Spanish police guys, and they have this sinister quality to them. You know what I mean? Like you're like not too sure about them. They have like the sinister voice, and it's kind of raspy and whatnot. And and you think that maybe they're going to be part of the problem. And then it's like, oh man, I was way wrong. These guys were not part of the problem. They're just, everybody's creepy around here. but it's like you stepped into a time machine going back and you know, and seeing the village and seeing the castle, and then obviously you're kind of like brought back into present day with the laboratory. It was different, and it was, you know, we've used the word refreshing to death during this video, but it cannot be overstated. It was what we're used to, just with a different environment, which made all the difference.
Absolutely.
So and what do you think about? What did you think about the settings? What did you think about the environments? What did, you know? Does it? Because I do know that there were some people who were disappointed that it didn't take place in Raccoon City, or a similar environment to that. What did you think being set in the different settings we did get?
Well, automatically I thought it was an interesting idea to put it in a village, but the thing is, a location is only as good as what you populate it with the villains in the series. But the other thing that they did too was they added an extra atmosphere in the game, where you start off the first couple of chapters in the village, and then as it progresses through, the village turns from day to night, and then it gets even creepier. And the other thing too is that as much as Resident Evil is known as a horror game or a horror survival game, we've never really gotten the gothic influence in a game before. True. And that was what particularly excited me about this game in particular when I first played it, because it was like, oh my God, a gothic Resident Evil game? I would have never thought of that, and it was freaking incredible to play through that. And also even adding the castles, and even adding just the underground nests for the bugs and all this other stuff there, and even also the broken down military complex as well too.
Yes.
Yeah. Like it was basically 5 games in one, and it was utterly brilliant going forward. And you have not seen a Resident Evil game like this before or since. Well, you know what? Let's go in and talk about our favorite boss battles for the game. Now, Resident Evil in particular, the series is not necessarily known for having very inventive boss battles. Like, you could argue Resident Evil 1 had the Tyrant, and Resident Evil 2 had Mr. X, and it also had the Gator and a couple other things. Nemesis was probably the closest to a differentiating thing from the franchise at that point. But they're all fairly simple, and there's not much strategy apart from just pointing your weapon at the right place and you're done. This one in particular, for Resident Evil 4, added so much complexity to its boss battles in terms of how you take down certain villains, in terms of what weapons you use, in terms of how your weapons are even upgraded to that point as well too.
And you know, it's very interesting you say that about the boss fights in general, where it's kind of like very generic, you know, kind of, well, maybe. Well, no, actually, I think that's a very fair word to use. It's generic. For the time, it was very generic for the stuff that you had to do in the previous games. Absolutely.
Well, the boss battles in all the previous games, they suffered from bullet sponge syndrome. You just sank so many bullets in them until they died. And again, that was fine for the time, but when you're trying to do something different, and when you're trying to do something unique, you want to try something else. And I thought this game, with the perspective that they were lending you with, and also with the fact that you could aim your weapon at certain body parts, they used it to its advantage, and they made a great choice in terms of what they could offer different to this franchise. So, and that led to the boss battles.
Yeah. Variety was really important here, not just in the bosses that you do play, but in how you go about disposing of them.
Absolutely.
It's not just going to be like, oh, we're going to chuck a flame grenade here. We're going to take a shotgun. You have to shoot the shotgun in the head here and then use the sniper rifle later. It wasn't just that. Like, everything was very creative. And there was a lot of thinking outside of the box. So that made it a much more intellectual game in that way. There was a lot more strategy in the game. And we've mentioned that in the past before when, you're in the house and they're trying to break in and how do you handle that and whatnot. But for every boss fight, not one boss fight was the same in terms of how you dispose of the villain. You know what I mean? Like,
absolutely.
It wasn't just like, oh, I can rely on my knowledge from how I beat this guy earlier to kind of, nope, that does not apply, sir. Like, you have to, every single villain requires a very unique way to take it down.
I want to know from you personally, what is your favorite boss battle in this game?
This one's very easy because I remember playing it. I was like, oh my God, it's like they made it just for me. Is Del Lago. Well, I mean, come on, we were gonna because if you don't consider Leatherface a boss fight, he's kind of like a sub boss fight if you think about it, because you're kind of facing the entire village, but he's like the centerpiece of that fight. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This was like the first main big boss fight in the game. And for a guy whose favorite movie is Jaws and has been Jaws for a long time, and who was introduced to the Gregory Peck iteration of Moby Dick at a very young age, I mean, that boss fight's satisfied both fascinations, because you've got this creature that's trying to eat you. It's not a shark, obviously. It's some sort of amphibian abomination. But it's trying to eat you. You're in this little boat going across the lake, and then your damn anchor gets hooked into it. And it's like, well, I gotta fucking take care of it. So thank God you have an endless supply of harpoons on board. And you're going after it like a whale. You're going after it like Moby Dick. You're just going out and throwing out the damn harpoons at it and chucking the harpoons at it. And then, obviously the thing knocks you out of the boat and you're like, oh, fuck. And you have to swim back to the boat. And then, of course, tap A. The thing starts coming in with the mouth open. You have to get into the boat before it dives under. You have to throw the harpoon in the mouth. One of my favorite boss fights in any game ever. It was so much fun, so much different from anything we got in any Resident Evil game before it. It was, God, I'll never forget playing that for the first time. I was just like, no, because when you get in the boat and you're going across the lake, you're kind of like, something tells me this is not going to be this easy. We're not just going to go from point A to point B and not have anything happen to us. Sure enough. It was one of those times where I wasn't even scared of the boss fight. I just loved playing it. It was just that much fun playing it. You know what I mean? It was just a thrill. Now, obviously, you feel the same way. So go ahead and tell me what you thought about Del Lago.
Honestly, Del Lago is definitely my favorite out of all the boss battles. But I'll throw another one in there a little later. But to piggyback off of you real quick, with Del Lago in particular, there was a particular moment where you could either go right or left to the lake. And there was one cutscene that popped up where if you go to the left, all of a sudden you see Leon just looking at the lake and basically viewing the paths that he needs to go through and stuff like that. And, he needs to cross through this lake. But you see that the Granados are tossing one of the cops from the beginning of the game, one of the corpses, into the lake and then just leaving them around. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, what are they doing that for? Oh, there's a giant thing just eating bodies as they toss them in. You're just like, crap, I'm going to need to do that next. But I remember in particular, Shinji Mikami, oh my God, again, tip of the cap to you, sir, on this. The minute I went towards that lake and I was like, you know what? I'm just going to shoot at the lake for no odd reason whatsoever. I started shooting at the lake, and then all of a sudden Del Lago comes out and fucking kills you right off the bat. I thought that was a brilliant little Easter egg where he's like, no, you're getting into that boat, man. Or if you're not getting into that boat, I'm going to freaking kill you. Just such a perfect moment to build that up in the game. But yeah, I can't agree more. Del Lago is definitely one of my favorite boss battles for the game in particular. But if we're going to bring another one into the fold as well too, that I think should also get a great honorable mention, Salazar's boss battle.
Yeah, Salazar's boss battle was fantastic.
Absolutely. Well, the thing is with Salazar in particular, he turns into this giant monster, and you are dealing with a boss battle in two different levels. One at the very base, where you have to take down the eyeballs. They're on him all the way through, and you also have to take down the little arms that he's using to basically bash you with. But also on top of that, you're also having to contend with the fact that the throne that he's sitting in turns into a freaking jaw and can kill you with one hit. And that was utterly brilliant in itself. And we're only talking about two different boss battles in the game. We're not even talking about the sub-boss battles. We're not talking about Torres Mendez, which was another great boss battle, or we're not talking about the Chainsaw Sisters or El Gigante for that matter.
Oh yeah, well, I was gonna mention the Giants. The Giants was like it was kind of like a Lord of the Rings moment when you're facing against the cave troll. Well, when the Fellowship faces against the cave troll in Fellowship of the Ring.
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. It's like, oh, fuck. Like, because you face the first one, and you think that's going to be the worst of it. And then later on, you have to face two of them.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, God, you guys just keep upping the ante. This is crazy. But it's not like, I mentioned this earlier, it's like every boss fight's different. And yes, you do fight El Gigante the first time solo, and then you have the two of them. So yes, it is the same villain. It's just, you have to dispose of them in different ways because of the environment you're in. You know what I mean? Like they keep switching it up. It's just no one boss fight's going to be the same, and that's why it was so exciting and so fresh to play it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. No, I absolutely agree with you. But honestly, I think the big question that we need to ask ourselves right now is, what makes this game hold up so well after 16 years? Plus, also with the added thing in as well too is that there is a rumor that there is a remake of 4 in development right now using the Resident Evil 2 and the Resident Evil 3 remake engine. And what are your thoughts on that?
So to answer the first part of the question, I think the reason the game holds up so well is because it was just very well made from the start. Hence why the ports themselves, I mean, like, we recently played it on PlayStation 4, for example.
Yes.
It's just everything from the ground up. It's one of those rare instances where a game nailed every single aspect, whether it be the graphics, the voice acting, the mechanics of the gameplay, locations, plot, characters, you name it. Everything is pitch perfect. It's a rare example of lightning in a bottle when it comes to a video game, where everything that could go right went right. And every time it was ported over, it carried over. And it never aged. It never aged. The gameplay itself was so smooth and so groundbreaking, so innovative, that it still holds up nearly 20 years later. 16 years later, here we are, man. And we're still talking about this game and how well it holds up and the aspects of it that we could talk about, for hours, frankly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the possibility of the remake. I personally think that it's not necessary. If they remade Resident Evil 4, it would sell like hotcakes. It would fly off the shelves. So I get that. For the monetary reasons, that makes sense to remake it. But the game as it is just if you can, just re-release it on PS5. If you can, if there's any way to re-release it on PS5 or the new Xbox, just do it. I mean, the game is there. There's no need to remake it. But if they're going to remake it, if it is true, if the rumor is true that they are remaking it as we speak, as we do this video, I think that the results from Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 have been strong enough to warrant optimism about it. I would be cautiously optimistic. However, I still maintain that it is completely unnecessary. You know what I mean? Because the game, despite being 16 years old, it still holds up very well because everything about it was ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. And it's almost kind of like, it was ahead of its time, and only just recently have games kind of moved past the advancements that Resident Evil 4 made. And in terms of taking horror gameplay and action gameplay and kind of moving it into the future, video games have finally caught up to that. It's only in the recent years that games have surpassed it. Mm-hmm. So if Capcom wants to remake it, so be it. I wouldn't do it myself. But that said, I am cautiously optimistic because of the remakes of 3 and 2 being so strong and so clean and so just polished and well done. I'd just be curious to see how it turned out, quite frankly. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it would be well worth doing. Maybe it would put the original to shame. I can't imagine that would be the case. But maybe that is what would happen. I don't know. I think the remake of Resident Evil 2, I mean, this might be blasphemous to some fans, but I think the remake of Resident Evil 2 and in some aspects Resident Evil 3 kind of blows the originals out of the water because it kind of does. I mean, that's what the advancement of technology and gameplay has done. It's the reality of it.
No, and I absolutely agree with you as well, too. And the thing is, like, again, there's so many questions to ask about how this game has held up in the 16 years since the release. I mean, we talked about the gameplay advancements. We talked about all this other stuff. But I think at the end of the day, what makes Resident Evil 4 still hold up after so many years is the amount of chances it took for the time. And those chances still held up after 16 years. So much so to the point that I personally, it's a hobby of mine to speed run through some of the Resident Evil games. Resident Evil 4 still remains a game I have a hard time speed running through just because it is not meant to be just a fast experience. It's meant to be something that you just go into and you just experience, and you have to fight these Ganados, and they're more unpredictable than your typical zombie. So that extends the length of the gameplay for so much. And it's still pretty long, and it's still very fulfilling to play through that game. However, with the remake, I agree that it is unnecessary, but the difference between Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 is we got a chance to miss those games. We got a chance to basically sit around and go, man, those games came out in 1998. I haven't played that since it was ported on the GameCube. And even on the GameCube, that was more than 10 or 12 years ago. Whereas with Resident Evil 4, that's been ported to every single console since the GameCube. I don't feel it's a game that we've had a chance to miss. And the fact that they're remaking it, I'm cautiously optimistic because of the fact that I loved RE2 and I loved RE3, both remakes, but I don't think it's entirely necessary. If I was to tell Capcom to remake one game that absolutely needs to be remade, remake Code Veronica.
Or if you're going to remake any game, remake Dino Crisis.
Oh, God.
Which we can dream of. But you know what? That's actually an excellent point. We have not had a chance to miss this game because it's always been around.
I mean, overall, for myself, I feel that a remake of Resident Evil 4 is not necessarily earned, but it's not unwelcomed for me.
That's a really good way to say it.
I'll still be willing to play it. I mean, hell, I'm a Resident Evil buff, so I'm going to play whatever comes out. I mean, hell, I played through 7 and I had the lowest of expectations playing through 7 after 6 came out, and 7 blew me away. So yeah, I'm absolutely 100% on board.
Yeah, no, I figured you'd say that. And I think that's a great way to kind of approach it. Like, you're not going to like reject it. You're going to, embrace it. It's Resident Evil. At the end of the day, it's Resident Evil. And it's also a remake of one of not just the greatest Resident Evil game ever made, but one of the greatest games in gaming history. So it's intriguing on that level.
It's my second all-time favorite game.
So there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So it'll be very interesting to see if this is proved true. Obviously, we got Resident Evil 8 coming down the pipeline. Ooh. But that doesn't mean that they can't just co-develop games at the same time. So we'll see. Who knows? Maybe we'll look back on this video and play the remake whenever it does come out, because I have a feeling it will be made. And we'll play it and we'll look back on this video and be like, oh, what were we so on edge about? What were we worried about? How do we get, but there's also the flip side to it, be like, we were right. Totally unnecessary.
Anyways, I mean, that's all I got on Resident Evil 4, man. Do you have any closing thoughts for the game?
Yeah, this video is basically a small sample of what our discussions about this game have been in the past. I mean, we could talk about this game for hours. If we were on a flight from LA to New York, we would the flight would go by like that, because we'd be talking about Resident Evil. Like, if we want to talk about Resident Evil 4 the entire time, we'd be like, oh wait, we landed already? We just got done talking about the main characters. We didn't get to talk about it. So I listened. One of the greatest games ever made, one of my 5 favorite games ever made. Playing it for the first time, it's one of the best experiences I ever had in my life in gaming. On the off chance that some of you have never played the game, please, by all means, play it. If you can play it, play it. It's to this day, it still holds up. Like we've said, it holds up. It is a masterpiece. It has not aged at all, frankly, in my opinion.
No.
And what else can I say?
No, there's a reason why I go back to it and I play it once a year. And part of the reason I play it once every year is because they keep releasing it on every console. Last year they released it on the Switch, and then the year before that it was the PS4 and Xbox and all this other stuff. So there is, if you really want to play this game, there is a way to play it. It's even on the iPad, for crying out loud.
Do you know a game that has been ported over as many times as this game has? I mean, shouldn't that say, like, doesn't that speak volumes about this game's importance and this game's endurance and its longevity, that it's been ported over on almost every single console? I mean, that's unheard of for me.
Absolutely. This game is the definition of a perfect game. It is aged so well in 16 years. I can still go back in and play it right from the very start. It's one of the best games ever made, hands down, period.
I mean, what else can I say? I think not only but a lot of other gamers out there agree with you. I mean, and perfect should never be a word that's used to describe a lot of video games or any other pieces of art. But this game is perfect head to toe. It's a masterpiece. Doesn't even do the game justice to what it really is.
Absolutely.
It's a game changer, no pun intended. So anyways, that'll do it for us. I'm Steve Cravens.
I'm Andres Gallego AKA Galleghost.
This has been the All-Time Gaming Series. This has been Shinji Mikami's Resident Evil 4. And if you like the video, my man Andres did all the editing, all the graphics, all the great stuff in this game. It's all him. Go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe. Go ahead and check out some of our other videos we've done for Video Games Past. We've done Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid, Last of Us Part 2, Max Payne, as well as some other movie retrospectives. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for stopping by, and we'll catch you on the next one.
Take care, guys.